The question of erasure. In the dim corridors of historical memory, one question rises like a shadow against the flickering light of certainty. What if an entire system of knowledge, an entire way of harnessing the forces of nature, had been deliberately erased from our past? For centuries, human civilizations have sought to bend the elements into service. We trace fire back to the Paleolithic hearth, we honor the water wheels of ancient Greece, and we mark the dawn of modernity in the smouldering engines of the Industrial Revolution. These are the stories mainstream history accepts, packaged neatly in textbooks and museum exhibits. Yet between the lines, there lingers the possibility of a lost chapter, a chapter that speaks of an enigmatic realm called Tartaria, where some say energy flowed not from coal or oil, but from the very atmosphere itself. The official record places Tartaria as a vague, shifting expanse in Central and Northern Asia, appearing on European maps from the 16th to the 19th century. The word itself faded as empires reorganized borders and maps became instruments of politics. In the libraries of St. Petersburg, one can still find 17th century globes that label vast tracts of land Tartary. Scholars tell us this was not a single empire, but rather a European shorthand for loosely known regions stretching across Siberia, Mongolia, and beyond. Yet into this uncertainty steps a peculiar alternative history whispered in online forums and late-night documentaries. Tartaria was more than a cartographic placeholder. It was a civilization, perhaps global in scope, harnessing forms of technology we can barely imagine today. Consider the architectural mysteries we inherit. From St. Basil's Cathedral in Moscow with its bulbous domes and gilded spires, to the elaborate expositions of the 19th century in Paris, Chicago, and San Francisco, buildings rose with a scale and speed that seem astonishing even by today's standards. Some suggest these were not mere aesthetic choices, but functional elements, resonant structures that captured, focused, and distributed natural energies in ways conventional science refuses to acknowledge. If true, the implications are staggering. Our ancestors may have tapped a form of free energy, perhaps akin to Nikola Tesla's experiments in atmospheric electricity at the turn of the 20th century. But the heart of the mystery lies not only in what might have existed, but in why it is absent now. Scholars still debate whether the vanishing of Tartaria is simply a matter of terminology, maps evolving, knowledge consolidating, or something more deliberate, an erasure of inconvenient truths. After all, the control of energy has always equated to the control of people. The transition from wood to coal, from coal to oil, and from oil to electricity has not only reshaped landscapes, but empires themselves. If there was once a way to draw limitless power directly from the sky, who would benefit from concealing it, and who would lose their grip on the levers of power? In the silence left by missing records, myth and speculation rush in. Was Tartaria undone by natural cataclysm, a flood, an ice storm, a cosmic event? Or was it undone by something more insidious, a rewriting of memory itself? When entire sections of encyclopedias vanish from later editions, when cathedrals resemble power stations more than chapels, when maps are redrawn with borders that erase civilizations, we are left with echoes of a troubling possibility. The question of erasure is not only about what was lost, but about what forces insisted we forget. And so the story begins not with certainty, but with absence. We stand at the threshold of an erased world, its traces scattered like embers in the ashes of time. Whether truth, half-truth, or elaborate fiction, Tartaria's supposed free energy remains one of history's most tantalizing phantoms. Whispers of a forgotten empire. Step into a candlelit library of the 18th century, and you might find an atlas spread across a heavy oak desk. Upon its parchment surface, Europe's familiar outlines curl along the left, while to the east sprawls an enigmatic word, Tartaria. To those mapmakers in London, Paris, or Amsterdam, Tartaria was less a nation than a vast unknown, an umbrella term for lands stretching across Siberia, Central Asia, and the fringes of China. Yet for centuries, the mere presence of that word whispered of a frontier so immense that it seemed to contain whole worlds within itself. Mainstream historians remind us that Tartaria was never a formal empire in the sense of Rome or the Ottomans. Rather, it was a label applied by Europeans to describe nomadic tribes, khanates, and shifting alliances inhabiting lands they poorly understood. The Russian Empire eventually consumed much of this territory, erasing Tartaria from maps by the 19th century. Still, to those inclined toward hidden histories, this disappearance does not look like mere cartographic housekeeping, it looks like a cover-up. Among the quirks that fuel such speculation are the maps themselves. Early cartographers, such as Gerardus Mercator in the 16th century, depicted Tartary not as barren tundra, but as a realm marked by cities, rivers, and even advanced trade routes. In some maps, regions are given strikingly specific names: Great Tartary, Independent Tartary, and Chinese Tartary, as though they were established polities. Scholars still debate whether these divisions reflected genuine geographic knowledge or simply imaginative guesswork. Yet, to modern eyes, they form the outline of something substantial, a forgotten power sprawling across a continent. Legends only deepen the intrigue. Travellers' accounts speak of strange machines glimpsed in Central Asian courts, or of vast cities wit. Architecture unlike anything in Europe. Some fringe researchers claim that explorers described light sources that required no oil, and metallic structures with properties unfamiliar to blacksmiths of their day. Mainstream historians dismiss such anecdotes as embellishments or mistranslations, but they linger in the background like whispers from another world. The silence is striking. By the mid-19th century, when empires prided themselves on cataloguing and conquering every corner of the globe, the label Tartaria simply vanished. In encyclopedias published before 1850, Tartaria appears in multiple entries. In later editions, it is gone. Was this a natural evolution of scholarship, or a deliberate pruning of inconvenient memory? Scholars still debate whether the transition was benign or calculated, but the absence itself invites curiosity. In fringe circles today, Tartaria has become more than a geographic term. It is imagined as a unified civilization, technologically sophisticated, perhaps rivaling or surpassing what we call modern. Some go further, suggesting that the towers, domes, and ornate facades scattered across Eurasia and beyond are not merely stylistic flourishes, but the fingerprints of Tartarian engineering. If so, then the empire has not entirely vanished. It lingers in stone, steel, and mystery. The whispers of a forgotten empire remain precisely that: whispers, elusive, fragile, and forever just beyond the reach of confirmation. Yet they compel us forward, as though history itself is inviting us to search the margins of old maps for a story untold. The architecture that shouldn't exist. Walk into a city square in St. Petersburg or wander through the boulevards of Prague, and you are greeted not just by monuments of empire, but by enigmas in stone. Ornate facades, colossal arches, and vast domes rise with such grace that even modern architects pause in admiration. These structures, many of them completed in astonishingly short spans of time, seem to embody more than beauty. They suggest knowledge. And to those who believe in Tartaria's lost technology, they represent physical proof of a forgotten mastery over energy itself. Take, for instance, the Winter Palace in St. Petersburg. Completed in 1762, it is said to contain over 1,500 rooms and nearly 2,000 windows. Historians celebrate the feat as a triumph of imperial will and imported European talent. Yet fringe researchers marvel at how such monumental construction could be completed in a mere 8 years, in a city that was scarcely a century old. How did builders in a swampy, frozen climate move stone on such a scale, while also outfitting the interiors with intricate woodwork, gilded ceilings, and perfect acoustics? Scholars still debate whether we underestimate the sheer manpower and ingenuity of the 18th century, or whether some unseen technology smoothed the process. Architecture worldwide raises similar questions. The Library of Congress in Washington, D.C., completed in the late 19th century, dazzled visitors with elaborate domes and rotundas supposedly constructed in record time. The Palace of Fine Arts in San Francisco, built for the 1915 Panama Pacific Exposition, was erected as a temporary structure but bore the grandeur of Rome. Many such exposition buildings, vast and ornate, were demolished after the events, their sudden disappearance feeding suspicion. Were these truly temporary plaster facades, or remnants of an older, unacknowledged civilization, swept away to fit a rewritten history? Quirky tidbits emerge in the details. Some cathedrals in Eastern Europe and Asia Minor possess metallic rods embedded within their domes, structures that, to speculative eyes, resemble modern electrical conductors. Ornamental spires, too delicate to serve defensive purposes, stretch toward the heavens like antennae. Scholars still debate whether these are merely artistic flourishes or whether they carried hidden functions, channeling atmospheric electricity, resonating with sound, or capturing energies we no longer recognize. The paradox of these buildings lies in their survival. Despite wars, revolutions, and centuries of neglect, many remain standing, their stonework pristine, their domes gleaming. Compare this to modern structures which often crumble after decades without maintenance. It raises a provocative question. Did past builders possess materials or methods we have since lost? Or is our interpretation of history itself incomplete? Mainstream narratives point to the Renaissance revival of classical styles, the ingenuity of immigrant craftsmen, and the patronage of powerful elites. Yet alternative histories press further. What if these buildings were not designed primarily as palaces, museums, or churches, but as components of an energy network, nodes in a web of free power, humming silently across continents? We cannot say for certain. What we can say is that architecture, more than any written record, stands as the most visible trace of human intention. Whether born of artistry, ambition, or a hidden science, these structures challenge us to wonder, are we looking at the past, or at fragments of a civilization deliberately obscured? The power beneath domes. Step into the nave of a great cathedral, perhaps the Hagia Sophia in Istanbul or St. Isaac's Cathedral in St. Petersburg, and tilt your head skyward. Above you rises a dome so vast, so impossibly suspended, that the air itself seems charged with reverence. For most visitors, these spaces inspire awe in the spiritual sense, but in the quieter corners of fringe history, another idea takes root. These domes were not merely symbols of faith, but instruments of power. Mainstream scholarship tells us that domes emerged from the ingenuity of Roman and Byzantine engineers. The Pantheon in Rome, with its perfect oculus, was completed around 126 CE and still stands today. Its dome, nearly 43 meters across, remains the world's largest unreinforced concrete dome. Historians rightly marvel at such feats, pointing to innovations in formwork and materials. Yet to those seeking Tartaria's traces, such domes and their later descendants hint at more than structural daring. They seem almost designed to resonate, to collect, or even to distribute energy. Scholars still debate whether these alignments with acoustics and natural frequencies were intentional artistry, or evidence of something we no longer understand. Consider the metallic crosses or spires often mounted at the apex of these domes. On Orthodox churches they rise like lightning rods, gleaming against the sky. In the 19th century, lightning protection was a known science, but earlier installations raise eyebrows. Were they spiritual symbols or functional conductors? Some fringe theorists suggest these spires might once have captured atmospheric electricity, channeling it into the building's structure below. Even the gilded coverings, whether gold leaf or copper plating, are reimagined as materials chosen for conductivity rather than ornament. Quirky anecdotes abound in some 18th and 19th century accounts. Visitors to domed halls describe faint humming sounds or strange feelings of vitality, as though the architecture itself amplified unseen forces. Cathedrals famous for their acoustics, the whispering galleries of St. Paul's in London, the echoing domes of Florence, become in this speculative lens not marvels of sound alone, but clues to a larger system, a world where resonance was key to harnessing power. The question is not limited to churches. The United States Capitol, with its grand dome, sits among a constellation of government buildings in Washington designed with classical motifs. The dome is capped with a statue, but beneath it lies a space once called the Whispering Gallery, famed for its peculiar acoustics. Scholars still debate whether this was a coincidence of design, a deliberate architectural trick, or perhaps a vestige of knowledge once widely understood. Mainstream historians, of course, caution us against overreaching. Domes, they remind us, are efficient ways to cover large spaces symbolic of heaven and impressive displays of wealth and power. Yet the persistence of dome and spire combinations across continents and centuries suggests more than a passing trend. Could it be that beneath the symbolism lay a functional purpose now forgotten, erased in the transition to coal and steam? If so, then the great domes we revere today may not merely crown our cities. They may be silent witnesses to a time when architecture itself was an engine, drawing power not from fire or fuel, but from the sky above. Expositions as a stage. Imagine the world in 1893, gathered in Chicago for the Columbian Exposition. 50 million visitors strolled through gleaming white boulevards, gazing at domes, colonnades, and arches that seemed plucked from a dream. The so-called White City covered nearly 700 acres, its buildings adorned with electric lighting that dazzled a generation only just awakening to the power of the incandescent bulb. To mainstream historians, the fair was a triumph of American ambition, designed by architects such as Daniel Burnham and powered by Westinghouse's alternating current. But to those who suspect Tartaria's traces, the exposition was not a beginning, but an ending, the final display of a technology soon to vanish from public sight. World's fairs were, at their heart, theatrical. Paris in 1889 unveiled the Eiffel Tower. St. Louis in 1904 celebrated innovation with monumental halls. Yet questions linger about the speed and scale of these expositions. Many of the ornate temporary buildings, constructed of plaster, wood, and staff, were said to be built within a few years, only to be demolished after the fair closed. Photographs show sprawling neoclassical palaces, domes larger than many cathedrals, and even intricate water systems. Could such marvels truly have been so disposable? Scholars still debate whether this was simply the extravagance of the Gilded Age, or whether something older was quietly erased under the guise of temporary exhibition. One quirky detail, often cited, is the use of electrical villages at these fairs. In Chicago, entire pavilions were illuminated not by crude wires strung overhead, but by concealed systems that seemed curiously advanced. Eyewitnesses described the city at night, glowing like a jewel. Was this merely the spectacle of early electrification, or a glimpse of technologies beyond what textbooks describe? Some alternati. V researchers go further. suggesting the fairs were staged as cover stories, excuses to explain the sudden appearance of monumental architecture left behind from a civilization we no longer acknowledge. Once the public had seen them, demolition ensured that questions could not linger. Consider also the 1906 San Francisco earthquake and fire, which destroyed many buildings eerily similar in style to exposition palaces. Within a few years, entire districts of old-world architecture were gone, replaced by modern grids. Was this simply urban renewal after tragedy, or an opportunity to wipe away remnants of a forgotten age? Scholars still debate whether disasters alone account for such sweeping changes, or whether the Great Resets of the 19th and early 20th centuries served a deeper purpose. Mainstream accounts celebrate these fairs as the birth of the modern city, the triumph of industry, and the optimism of nations on the rise. Yet to those who peer through the cracks, the expositions look like a stage, a place where old architecture was repurposed, shown briefly to the masses, and then destroyed before its origins could be fully questioned. What remains are photographs, sepia images of vast domes and colonnades, crowds strolling across plazas that seem to belong to another era. They whisper of a possibility too unsettling to dismiss, that we were not building these wonders for the first time, but inheriting them, only to erase them once again. The enigma of the star forts. Across Europe, Asia, and the Americas, a peculiar geometric pattern emerges from the landscape, massive, star-shaped fortifications carved into earth and stone. From the bastions of Bourtange in the Netherlands to the imposing structures in India and even far-flung examples in North America, these star forts are celebrated by military historians as masterpieces of Renaissance design. Their sharp angles and radiating points, developed in the 15th and 16th centuries, were meant to deflect cannon fire and eliminate blind spots. That is the official story. Yet for many who search the shadows of Tartaria, star forts are more than military curiosities. They are puzzles that hint at an entirely different purpose. The mainstream view rests on practicality. Gunpowder had rendered medieval castles obsolete. Star forts with their low walls and angular bastions offered new defences. Indeed, scholars can point to Italian architect Michele San Micheli, whose 16th century designs spread across Europe, and to the French engineer Sébastien Leprestre de Vauban, whose fortifications became models of military science. Still, the sheer number of these forts, numbering in the thousands worldwide, raises questions. Could so many elaborate, labour-intensive structures truly have been built only for war? Scholars still debate whether we are underestimating both the resources available and the desperation of empires during those turbulent centuries. Fringe interpretations see something else. Energy. From above, star forts resemble intricate mandalas with radial symmetry and layered geometry. Their moats, channels, and embankments form precise patterns that seem almost designed for resonance. Alternative researchers propose that these forts might once have functioned as energy collectors, perhaps channeling water and earth currents in ways akin to natural battery. The placement of some forts near rivers or coastlines only deepens the speculation. Were they designed not only for defence, but to interact with the very flow of nature? Quirky anecdotes fuel the mystery. In some old accounts, visitors noted unusual acoustic properties within star forts, footsteps echoing strangely, cannon blasts muffled in unexpected ways. Others claim plants grew more vigorously in the fertile soil of abandoned bastions, as though the geometry itself influenced natural energies. While such claims remain far outside mainstream study, they linger like faint signals from another interpretation of the past. Consider also the scale of preservation. Many star forts survive today in remarkably intact condition despite centuries of neglect. Their sharp outlines remain visible even from satellite imagery, cutting across landscapes like signatures left deliberately for future eyes. If they were simply military relics, why do they so often inspire awe that feels more spiritual than strategic? Scholars still debate whether their endurance reflects superior engineering or whether the question of their true purpose has yet to be asked in earnest. Mainstream history assures us that star forts were weapons of stone, products of an age defined by gunpowder and siege. Yet their beauty, their ubiquity, and their almost cosmic symmetry suggest a second story, one in which geometry was not only defensive but generative, harnessing forces hidden in plain sight. If so, then the enigma of the star forts may not be about keeping enemies out, but about keeping knowledge in, buried beneath layers of accepted history. Tesla's shadow over Tartaria. At the turn of the 20th century, a lone inventor stood beneath the Colorado sky, coaxing lightning from the heavens. Nikola Tesla, the Serbian-American visionary, dreamed of transmitting energy wirelessly, of drawing power directly from the atmosphere and distributing it freely across the globe. His Wardenclyffe Tower on Long Island, completed in 1901, rose like a modern spire, a 187-foot structure topped with a copper dome, intended not to broadcast radio, as some would later suggest, but to tap into the earth and sky themselves. Mainstream history tells us that financial backers, including J.P. Morgan, abandoned Tesla's project once it became clear that free energy could not be monetized. The tower was dismantled in 1917, and Tesla died decades later in near obscurity. Yet, in the alternative histories of Tartaria, Tesla's story is not a tragic anomaly, it is an echo. His vision of wireless power is interpreted as a modern rediscovery of what the Tartarians had supposedly mastered centuries, perhaps millennia, before. The domes, spires, and antenna-like towers we have already explored suddenly align with Tesla's experiments: architecture as receiver, city as conductor, civilization as a seamless grid of power without wires. Scholars still debate whether Tesla's designs were genuinely feasible, or the hopeful dream of a genius pushing beyond the limits of his era, but the parallels remain striking. Quirky anecdotes deepen the shadow. Some claim that Tesla himself hinted at ancient precedents. In private conversations, he supposedly referred to forgotten civilizations and their mastery of natural forces. Whether these remarks were ever truly spoken or are later embellishments is uncertain. What is certain is Tesla's fascination with resonance, the idea that everything in the universe vibrates at specific frequencies, and that energy could be transmitted by tuning into these harmonics. It is here that believers in Tartaria's free energy find resonance of their own, suggesting that ancient domes and star forts were not aesthetic flourishes, but resonant machines humming with the same principles Tesla pursued. Mainstream accounts of Tesla emphasize his eccentricity, his conflict with Edison, and his pioneering role in the development of alternating current. But they also note his frustrations. His wireless power projects never reached full fruition, and many of his notes were confiscated by government agencies after his death in 1943. Scholars still debate whether these confiscations were routine security measures during wartime, or whether Tesla had indeed stumbled upon something too disruptive to release. For those who trace the shadows of Tartaria, Tesla's fate embodies a larger pattern, knowledge glimpsed, then erased. If Tartaria had once wielded wireless power, then Tesla was its modern prophet, struggling to revive a truth long buried. His tower's destruction, like the demolition of exposition palaces or the disappearance of map entries, becomes another act in a centuries-long play, the concealment of free energy guarded jealously by those whose power depends on scarcity. Tesla's story reminds us of the fragility of memory. A single man can stand beneath the stars and glimpse infinity, yet without the right context or without protection, his vision may vanish as quickly as it appeared. If Tartaria's knowledge once existed, then Tesla's lonely experiments may have been the faint after-image of an erased civilization, flickering briefly before being consigned once more to silence. Mainstream history's silence. When one walks through the marble halls of academic history, Tartaria is rarely mentioned. Professors speak at length about the rise of the Romanovs, the vastness of the Mongol Empire, or the industrial march of Europe, but the word Tartaria is treated as an antiquated term, a relic of old maps rather than a lost civilization. In encyclopedias of the early 19th century, Tartary appears frequently. In later editions, it fades into footnotes or disappears entirely. Mainstream history does not argue Tartaria was erased. It argues it never existed in the way conspiracy theorists imagine. Yet this silence, intentional or not, creates fertile ground for questions. The official explanation is simple. By the mid-1800s, the Russian Empire had consolidated its territories across Siberia and Central Asia. Cartographers no longer needed vague labels like Great Tartary or Chinese Tartary. Knowledge advanced, maps improved, and names were standardized. The process was not sinister, scholars argue, but inevitable. After all, old names vanish regularly. Cathay became China, Persia became Iran, the Ottoman Empire became Turkey. Scholars still debate whether the fading of Tartaria was merely part of this natural evolution or whether its abruptness was unusual enough to merit suspicion. Alternative histories, however, seize on the silence. They point to the striking erasure of Tartaria from popular consciousness. Why do we know of ancient Sumer, a civilization 5,000 years gone, but not of Tartaria, a name present on maps less than 2 centuries ago? Why do textbooks breeze past it, offering little more than a footnote? The lack of narrative feels conspicuous, as though someone decided that no story should remain. Quirky tidbits reinforce this perception. In the 1771 edition of the Encyclopaedia Britannica, Tartary is described as a vast region stretching across Asia, with divisions such as Great Tartary and Little Tartary. Yet by the 19th century editions, those entries vanish. Some fringe researchers even claim that libraries quietly discarded or edited older texts, though mainstream librarians dismiss this as routine updating. Still, the contrast is stark. A once vast empire described in formal print, then gone. Scholars still debate whether this represents simple archival housekeeping or the deliberate pruning of history. This silence does not prove anything, but it resonates with patterns. Tesla's confiscated notes, exposition buildings demolished, star forts left unexplained. Each piece feeds into a broader suspicion. Could it be that mainstream history is not merely incomplete, but curated? The absence of Tartaria from modern discourse feels less like neglect and more like avoidance, an elephant in the room that scholars decline to acknowledge. Of course, professional historians argue that the burden of proof lies with those making extraordinary claims. There are no surviving Tartarian records, no definitive artifacts, no clear evidence of a civilization wielding advanced energy. What exists are maps, architecture, and anomalies, stitched together by those seeking a larger pattern. Scholars still debate whether such patterns reveal truth or simply the human tendency to weave stories from coincidence. Yet silence, too, is powerful. The lack of answers invites imagination, and imagination fills the void. Whether or not Tartaria was real in the way its believers imagine, its absence from mainstream history ensures that whispers of it will never fully die. For in the gaps of silence, we hear the echoes of what might have been and perhaps what was deliberately forgotten, maps that tell strange stories. Spread out an antique map from the age of exploration, and the past speaks in ink. Across parchment seas and mountains drawn like jagged teeth, a single word sprawls over northern Asia, Tartaria. On 16th and 17th century maps by cartographers such as Abraham Ortelius and Gerardus Mercator, Tartaria appears immense, dwarfing many known kingdoms. Its borders stretch from the Caspian Sea to the Pacific Ocean, and from the Arctic tundra down toward India and Persia. In the margins, strange notes appear, references to tribes, rulers, and regions that seem simultaneously specific and mysterious. To mainstream historians, these maps reflect European uncertainty. To Tartaria's seekers, they tell another story, a vast empire whose memory was reduced to a cartographic placeholder, then erased altogether. One mainstream fact stands out. In Mercator's famous 1569 world map, Great Tartary dominates northern Asia. Alongside it appear divisions such as Independent Tartary near present-day Uzbekistan and Chinese Tartary abutting the Ming Empire. Scholars explain these as catch-all labels for areas Europeans did not fully control or understand. And indeed, maps of the era often exaggerated or distorted faraway lands. Yet even within these allowances, the consistency of Tartaria across centuries of maps suggests something more than idle guesswork. Scholars still debate whether this persistence represents genuine recognition of a cultural political entity or merely the inertia of cartographic tradition. Fringe researchers point to quirky details. On some maps, Tartaria is marked with cities, dozens of them, though no corresponding ruins are known today. Other maps include notes about White Tartars, Black Tartars, and Muscovite Tartars, categories that hint at complex societies rather than undefined wilderness. Some even depict strange geography, sea features like a vast inland sea in Siberia that no longer exists, or mountain ranges curiously absent from modern surveys. Were these errors or memories of landscapes since reshaped by cataclysm? Adding to the intrigue, many of these maps were produced in the very centuries when European colonial powers were aggressively documenting the world. Spain catalogued the Americas, Britain mapped India, and France charted Africa. Why then did the same powers retain such vague, sweeping terms for Asia? Scholars still debate whether the political complexity of Central Asia simply defied neat categorization, or whether something about Tartaria resisted precise recording. One curious map often cited is by Joseph Nicolas de Lisle, an 18th century French cartographer working in Russia. His works showed not only Great Tartary, but also odd references to civilizations along the Arctic coast. Fringe thinkers seize on this. If Tartaria stretched into icy Siberia, could its ruins now lie hidden beneath permafrost? With climate shifts slowly revealing long-buried mammoths and ancient tools, the idea of forgotten cities waiting in the ice does not feel entirely impossible. Mainstream historians remind us that maps are not mirrors, but interpretations, shaped by politics, religion, and rumour. They caution against reading too much into old names. Yet the sheer weight of Tartaria, across map after map, makes the silence of later centuries all the louder. Scholars still debate whether the story is simply one of evolving nomenclature, or whether these maps preserve a glimpse of something we were not meant to remember. For those who search, the maps are not curiosities, but breadcrumbs. They beckon us toward a land that official history no longer acknowledges, whispering through their faded ink that perhaps the world was once mapped differently, not only in geography, but in memory, the Great Reset idea. In the darker corners of alternative history, a phrase circulates with unsettling weight: the Great Reset. Not the modern policy initiatives of our own time, but a far older, more mysterious concept. According to these theories, human civilization has experienced sudden, sweeping erasures, cataclysms that wipe away not only people and cities, but memory itself. Tartaria, in this vision, was the victim of such a reset. Its energy systems, its architecture, its very identity were not lost gradually but excised suddenly, leaving only fragments for us to puzzle over. Mainstream history acknowledges that disasters have indeed reshaped societies. The eruption of Vesuvius in 79 CE buried Pompeii under ash. The 1755 Lisbon earthquake levelled an entire city. The Mongol invasions of the 13th century devastated Eurasia. Cataclysms are not conspiracy, they are fact. Yet proponents of the Tartarian narrative argue that something different occurred, a coordinated event or series of events designed not only to destroy but to erase. Scholars still debate whether patterns of rapid change in the 18th and 19th centuries, mudfloods, fires, epidemics, were simply the unfortunate rhythm of history, or whether they cluster too neatly around the disappearance of Tartaria from maps. The mudflood theory is perhaps the most famous expression of this reset idea. Across Europe and North America, buildings appear with windows and doors partially buried below ground level as though entire streets had sunk overnight. Mainstream explanations point to shifting ground levels, reconstruction, or simple design choices. But fringe researchers argue these are scars of a sudden deluge, a flood of earth that buried entire cities in a matter of days. They suggest the mid-19th century as a turning point, when countless structures were submerged and then repurposed by new powers, that air origins obscured under layers of mud. Quirky accounts from newspapers of the era add fuel. Reports from the 1800s describe inexplicable fires that consumed entire districts, strange floods that arrived without storms, or earthquakes with no apparent epicenter. San Francisco's 1906 disaster is often cited. A fire following an earthquake destroyed vast swathes of ornate architecture, leaving modernist replacements in their stead. Was this coincidence, or part of a larger pattern? Scholars still debate whether the clustering of such events represents bad luck, or the selective memory of those seeking to prove a theory. The Great Reset concept also extends beyond natural disaster. Proponents argue that resets involve deliberate human action, rewriting encyclopedias, altering calendars, renaming territories, and displacing populations. Orphan trains in 19th century America, which moved thousands of children across the country, are interpreted not as charity but as resettlement after catastrophe. Each act becomes, in this lens, not random but coordinated, part of an effort to overwrite one version of history with another. Mainstream historians reject such sweeping claims, pointing out the lack of verifiable evidence for a global conspiracy. They note that resets in the form of revolution, colonization, and technological change are already acknowledged as history. Yet the idea persists, perhaps because it resonates with an ancient fear that we might be living on the ruins of something greater, our own story, but a sequel written after the pages of the original were torn away. If Tartaria was real, then perhaps it was not defeated in battle, nor dissolved by treaties. Perhaps it was reset, deliberately buried under earth, fire, and silence. And if resets can happen once, the question lingers uneasily in the background. How many times before have we begun again, without Evie Cult? And knowing what came before, the puzzle of orphaned cities. Imagine walking through a silent town, broad avenues, grand facades, windows gazing blankly across deserted squares. No footsteps echo, no merchants haggle, no children play. It is not the silence of ruin, but of vacancy, as though the builders left only yesterday, and the inhabitants never arrived. Across historical records, there appear accounts of such orphaned cities, vast urban spaces that seem to have been constructed without clear evidence of who built them, or why they were suddenly empty. Mainstream history points to many examples of urban planning projects that never reached fruition. The Russian Empire, for instance, founded cities across Siberia during the 18th and 19th centuries to expand trade and military presence. Some of these, such as Yakutsk, struggled against the cold but survived. Others never grew beyond blueprints and foundations. Similarly, in North America, ambitious towns were sometimes laid out on maps, complete with streets and squares, only to collapse after economic booms fizzled. Scholars still debate whether such cases are best understood as failures of ambition or signs of something more unusual. Fringe researchers, however, look at photographs and illustrations from the 19th century with a different eye. They note images of streets lined with ornate stone buildings, captured at moments when the city looks eerily empty. Were these photographs taken at dawn, or staged with long exposure times that erased moving crowds? Or were these truly orphan cities, suddenly without populations? The question lingers, unsettling in its ambiguity. One quirky detail comes from St. Petersburg itself. When Peter the Great established the city in 1703, it was said to have sprung up almost overnight on marshland. Within decades, it boasted grand palaces, wide avenues, and complex canals. Historians explain this by pointing to the empire's massive resources and imported European architects. But to alternative historians, St. Petersburg is the ultimate orphan city, a jewel that seems too complete, too advanced, too sudden in its appearance. Was it truly built from scratch, or was it repurposed, inherited from a civilization whose memory was swiftly erased? Even further afield, similar puzzles appear. In Central Asia, travellers of the 18th century described finding fortified cities abandoned in the desert, with walls intact but no inhabitants. In North America, photographs of early San Francisco show broad streets lined with elaborate stone structures, before the gold rush supposedly drew masses to the region. If so many had only just arrived, who built the city before them? Scholars still debate whether these examples are misinterpretations of urban development or tantalizing glimpses of forgotten inheritances. The absence of people is what unsettles most. Buildings do not construct themselves, and cities without stories beg for explanation. Were these orphan cities the product of failed imperial projects, or were they remnants of Tartaria, passed down to new rulers who claimed them as their own? Mainstream history cautions us against leaping too quickly into myth. Records exist, blueprints, correspondence, financial ledgers, that show how cities were funded and staffed. Yet even with such explanations, the photographs and maps still carry an uncanny weight. The puzzle of orphan cities is less about what we know and more about what feels missing. The human imprint, the narrative thread, the continuity that anchors us to place. And so we return to the silence at the heart of the Tartarian question. These cities, whether abandoned or abruptly inhabited, stand like empty shells on the shore of history, waiting for us to ask who built them and why their story slipped away. Frozen in time, Siberia. Vast, silent and unyielding, Siberia stretches across 11 time zones, an ocean of land where ice and forest seem eternal. To most historians, it is a backdrop of exile, resource extraction and harsh climate. Yet within its frozen expanse lie whispers of something older, ruins and relics that appear out of place, fragments of architecture and legend that suggest Siberia may hold the buried heart of Tartaria. Mainstream history acknowledges Siberia's complexity. Archaeologists have uncovered ancient petroglyphs along the Yenisei River, Bronze Age kurgans scattered across the steppes, and Paleolithic mammoth bone dwellings in places like Kostenki, dating back over 20,000 years. The Scythians and later nomadic peoples left trails of artifacts, golden ornaments, weapons, and textiles preserved miraculously by permafrost. Scholars marvel at these finds, yet they fit comfortably within the narrative of steppe cultures. Still, The sheer scale of Siberia leaves vast tracts unexplored, and scholars still debate whether its under-ice secrets could conceal more than conventional archaeology dares to expect. Fringe researchers seize upon the anomalies. Travellers' accounts from the 18th and 19th centuries sometimes mention vast stone walls deep in the wilderness, or mounds so regular in shape they seemed artificial. Some speak of colossal ruins near Lake Baikal, where legends tell of ancient cities now swallowed by water. Others point to peculiar patterns in the tundra visible from the air, resembling geometric structures too orderly to be natural. Are these remnants of forgotten tribes, or the bones of a civilization erased from memory? Quirky anecdotes deepen the mystery. In 1929, Soviet geologists exploring the Tunguska region, decades after the famous meteor explosion of 1908, claimed to find metallic fragments embedded in the ground, arranged almost like panels. Official reports attributed the Tunguska blast to a meteor airburst, flattening 800 square miles of forest. Yet some later speculations wonder if it was instead the catastrophic failure of an unknown energy device, perhaps Tartarian in origin, a relic of technology still pulsing beneath Siberia's soil. Scholars still debate whether such theories are science fiction intruding upon science fact. The climate itself serves as both protector and eraser. Siberia's permafrost preserves ancient remains in pristine condition. Woolly mammoths emerge with flesh intact, their stomachs filled with Ice Age grasses. If organic matter can survive for millennia, could structures also be entombed beneath the frozen ground, waiting for discovery? As global warming accelerates, each thawing summer reveals new artifacts. It is tempting to imagine that one day the ice will part not only to release mammoths, but entire cities frozen in time. Mainstream historians, cautious as ever, remind us of practical limits. Siberia's terrain is difficult, its archaeology underfunded, and its legends often shaped by myth. Yet even within this caution there is acknowledgement. Much remains unknown. Scholars still debate whether Siberia's emptiness is truly emptiness, or a veil concealing layers of human history still unread. For those attuned to Tartaria's whispers, Siberia is not a wasteland, but a vault. Its silence feels deliberate, its vastness like a canvas scrubbed clean. If Tartaria once existed, then perhaps its heart still lies beneath these frozen forests, waiting to be thawed by time, or remembered by those who refuse to let the story end. Sound as power. Stand inside a cavernous hall beneath a great dome and speak softly. The walls carry your words in curious ways, sometimes amplifying, sometimes swallowing, sometimes bending them until they emerge as whispers at the far end of the chamber. For most of us, this is an acoustic curiosity, but for those who search the shadows of Tartaria, sound itself becomes something more, a key to the lost science of free energy. Mainstream history acknowledges that ancient builders understood acoustics with remarkable precision. The Greeks designed amphitheatres like Epidaurus, where a murmur at centre stage can be heard clearly by thousands. The Mayan temple at Chichen Itza produces the cry of a quetzal bird when a clap echoes against its stairways. Medieval cathedrals were built to enhance chant and prayer, their vaults carrying sacred sound to every ear. These are celebrated as marvels of design, achieved through empirical knowledge. Scholars still debate whether the sophistication of these effects was entirely intentional, or the serendipitous outcome of trial and error. Fringe interpretations push further. They suggest that ancient and pre-modern architecture harnessed resonance not only for ritual or art, but for energy itself. Sound, after all, is vibration. Vibration is energy. Domes, vaults, and chambers could have functioned as resonators, amplifying natural frequencies in ways we have forgotten how to measure. Could certain buildings have been tuned like instruments, not only producing sound but drawing upon it? Quirky anecdotes abound. In some Orthodox churches of Russia, visitors report physical sensations during chant, tingling skin, vibrations in the chest, even feelings of euphoria. While mainstream explanations point to psychosomatic effects or the sheer beauty of music, alternative thinkers propose that these sensations might be remnants of a technos ology where resonance interacted directly with the human body. Similarly, Tibetan singing bowls, Egyptian temples, and even Stonehenge are all reimagined not as ritual tools, but as devices designed to manipulate sound waves for power. The idea is not without precedent in modern science. Acoustic levitation, demonstrated in laboratories, can suspend small objects using nothing but sound waves. Sonoluminescence creates bursts of light from bubbles when exposed to high-frequency sound. If such effects can be harnessed in controlled experiments today, is it unthinkable that earlier civilizations might have stumbled upon their own ways of channeling sonic energy? Scholars still debate whether parallels between modern experiments and ancient architecture are coincidences or fragments of forgotten continuity. In Tartarian lore, sound becomes part of the free energy puzzle. The domes and spires we've encountered might not only have captured atmospheric electricity, but also harmonized with vibrations of the earth itself. Just as Tesla sought resonance to transmit power wirelessly, Tartaria's architects may have built cities that sang in harmony with nature, drawing upon frequencies we no longer perceive. Mainstream history, of course, is wary. No verifiable evidence exists that sound was ever used to power cities. And yet, the persistence of resonance across so many cultures and structures makes the question difficult to dismiss entirely. Why would civilizations separated by oceans and centuries consistently design monuments with such profound acoustic properties? Perhaps it was ritual. Perhaps it was beauty. Or perhaps, just perhaps, it was a science. One whose notes we have lost, leaving us only the faint reverberations in stone halls and the suspicion that once, long ago, sound itself was power. Cathedrals or power plants? Step into Notre Dame of Paris, Cologne Cathedral, or St. Isaac's Cathedral in St. Petersburg. Stained glass ignites the air with colour, spires pierce the sky, and bells once summoned thousands. These cathedrals are revered as houses of worship, masterpieces of art and devotion. Yet some alternative histories pose a startling question. Were these soaring monuments not only spiritual centres but functional machines, architectural devices designed to harness and distribute energy? Mainstream scholarship offers solid explanations for their grandeur. Medieval cathedrals, we are told, were built over centuries by armies of masons, funded by church tithes and royal patronage. Their pointed arches and ribbed vaults were engineering innovations, allowing stone to climb higher than ever before. The cathedrals symbolized heaven, their spires reaching toward the divine. Still, even mainstream experts marvel at the precision of these projects, some of which took hundreds of years to complete. Scholars still debate whether the extraordinary acoustics and light effects were the product of deliberate science or mystical intuition. Fringe theorists, however, see something more tangible. They point to the metal finials, crosses, and weather vanes crowning the towers, structures suspiciously like antennae. They note that many cathedrals are capped with gilded domes or copper roofing, materials prized for their conductivity. Inside, soaring columns and vaulted ceilings form resonant cavities, while elaborate rose windows suggest geometric designs more complex than mere decoration. Could these cathedrals once have functioned as nodes in an energy network, capturing atmospheric electricity and channeling it for practical use? Quirky stories reinforce the possibility. Pilgrims across centuries reported feeling physically renewed after entering certain cathedrals. Drolls, describing sensations of warmth, vibration, or healing. In Chartres Cathedral, the labyrinth inlaid on the floor was said to induce altered states when walked slowly, a spiritual journey, or perhaps a way to attune the body to resonant frequencies within the building itself. In Cologne, locals once believed the cathedral's bells could ward off storms. Was this superstition, or a faint memory of an earlier function? Scholars still debate whether such tales reflect folklore alone, or hints of deeper interaction with natural forces. Even the placement of these cathedrals draws suspicion. Many stand upon older sacred sites, pagan temples, megalithic circles, or ancient crossroads. Mainstream historians attribute this to religious continuity, new faiths overwriting old. Yet if one believes in hidden energy lines, so-called ley lines, the pattern takes on new meaning. Perhaps these sites were chosen not only for symbolic reasons, but because they intersected with the Earth's subtle energies, making them ideal for resonant architecture. Mainstream historians urge caution. There is no direct evidence that cathedrals were ever designed as power plants. Their records, when preserved, speak of devotion, not electricity. Yet the physical reality of their forms, from towering spires to intricate windows, invites speculation. Scholars still debate whether we underestimate the practical knowledge embedded in sacred architecture, or whether we are overlaying modern anxieties onto medieval stones. Still, the question lingers. When we look at cathedrals only as monuments of faith, do we risk missing another layer of their story? Perhaps they were both, sanctuaries for the spirit and silent engines of power, blending art, science, and mystery in ways we have yet to rediscover. The question of mud floods. Across the world, from Eastern Europe to North America, curious architectural anomalies appear in plain sight. Walk along old streets in Moscow, St. Petersburg, or even Chicago, and you may notice buildings with windows and doorways sunk half buried below the present ground level. In some cases, entire lower floors are accessible only by descending steps into the earth. For mainstream historians, these features are the result of urban evolution, roads raised over time, foundations shifted, floods or reconstruction altering street levels. But for those who follow the mysteries of Tartaria, these are not quirks of construction. They are evidence of a cataclysm, a sudden mud flood that buried entire cities in the 18th or 19th century, resetting history in its wake. Mainstream facts lend a plausible explanation. In St. Petersburg, for example, heavy flooding from the Neva River repeatedly covered parts of the city, leading authorities to raise embankments and streets over the years. Similarly, in London and Paris, centuries of paving and rebuilding often raised ground levels above older foundations. Scholars still debate whether these changes were gradual or abrupt, but the consensus points to long-term urban development. Fringe researchers, however, note patterns too widespread to ignore. They argue that buried lower floors are not confined to flood-prone cities, but appear across continents, from European capitals to frontier towns in the United States. San Francisco, photographed after the 1906 earthquake, shows blocks of ornate stone buildings whose basements appear suspiciously like ground floors swallowed by earth. If these were simply basements, why do they so often feature grand windows and decorative facades clearly meant to be seen? Quirky accounts from newspapers of the 19th century add fuel to the fire. Reports describe mysterious layers of mud engulfing cities after storms, even when rainfall seemed insufficient to produce such deluges. In New York, Accounts of sudden subsidence in certain districts led to speculation that the very ground was unstable. For mud flood theorists, these stories point not to accidents of weather, but to a global event or series of events that blanketed cities under layers of silt and soil, conveniently burying evidence of a prior civilization. Scholars still debate whether these anecdotes reflect exaggeration, metaphor, or a glimpse of something stranger. Consider also the architectural mismatch. Buildings supposedly constructed in the 19th century often display styles, massive stone blocks, intricate ornamentation, and vaulted interiors that seem far more advanced than their historical context would suggest. Was 19th century technology truly capable of producing such feats on schedule, or were these structures inherited from an earlier civilization, only to be half buried by catastrophe and then claimed as new? Mainstream historians argue firmly against such interpretations. They remind us that photographs, city plans, and construction records exist to document these projects. Yet even within that certainty, they admit that our cities are layered palimpsests, where the old is often hidden beneath the new. Scholars still debate whether the mud flood theory is a radical misreading of this layering, or whether its persistence reflects a genuine unease with gaps in the official narrative. The buried doorways and sunken windows remain, silent and stubborn, across the world. They invite us to ask, were they the result of patient centuries of urban growth, or the scars of a sudden global event that covered Tartaria's traces beneath a blanket of earth? In their mute testimony, the ground itself seems to whisper of something lost, half hidden beneath our very feet, the archives of suppression. If history is a story, then archives are its memory. They hold the manuscripts, the encyclopedias, the maps, the official decrees that anchor past to present. And yet, scattered through the record, we find silences, gaps where entries vanish, references shift, and knowledge seems deliberately pruned. For those who believe Tartaria once thrived, these silences are not accidents of preservation, but evidence of suppression, the careful removal of inconvenient truths from the shelves of memory. Mainstream historians readily acknowledge that archives are imperfect. Fires, wars, and neglect have destroyed countless libraries. The burning of the Library of Alexandria in antiquity, the destruction of Baghdad's House of Wisdom in 1258, the losses of countless monasteries during Europe's religious wars. Even in modern times, the Library of Congress suffered fires in the 19th century that consumed thousands of volumes. Scholars still debate whether these disasters were mere misfortune or, in some cases, deliberate acts of cultural erasure. Fringe researchers point to specific cases. The Encyclopaedia Britannica, for instance, described Tartary in detail in its 1771 edition, portraying it as a vast region with defined subdivisions. By the mid-19th century, these entries were gone, replaced by narrower references to Russia, Siberia, and Central Asia. Was this simply the result of improved geography or the excision of an entire civilization? Similarly, researchers claim that maps and books, once common in European libraries, now appear to have vanished, with only fragmentary references remaining. Scholars still debate whether this reflects ordinary archival turnover or a deliberate narrowing of what the public is allowed to see. Quirky stories cling to these silences. In the Soviet Union, certain pre-revolutionary texts were quietly withdrawn or altered, written to align with Marxist-Leninist ideology. In the United States, school textbooks have likewise been revised to emphasize some narratives over others, quietly omitting details deemed unimportant. These examples demonstrate that suppression is not merely theoretical, it is a recurring feature of power. If modern states curate memory, could earlier ones have done the same, ensuring that Tartaria faded not by chance, but by decree? There are also the mysteries of confiscated manuscripts. Nikola Tesla's notes, seized by the US government upon his death in 1943, remain partially classified. Fringe thinkers draw a parallel. Just as Tesla's work on wireless energy was hidden from view, so too could Tartaria's records have been locked away in vaults, labelled irrelevant or dangerous. Scholars still debate whether such actions were precautionary or protective of vested interests. Mainstream historians urge caution against grand conspiracy. Archival silence, they argue, is often explained by mundane causes, budgets, fires, or the natural decay of paper and ink, and yet, they concede, archives are not neutral, they are curated, shaped by those in power, and what survives often reflects not the fullness of the past, but the priorities of those who wrote it. The question, then, is not whether archives can be altered. They can, and they are. The question is whether Tartaria's story was one of those alterations, deliberately excised from the pages of history. And if so, then the silence in our libraries is not emptiness but a carefully constructed void, an absence that speaks as loudly as any surviving record. The industrial takeover. By the late 18th century, the air of Europe and North America had begun to change. Coal smoke drifted across skylines, blackening stone, choking lungs, and announcing the arrival of the Industrial Revolution. Steam engines roared, textile mills multiplied, railways slashed across fields and forests. Official history celebrates this transformation as the dawn of progress, the leap that propelled humanity into modernity. But in the narrative of Tartaria, the industrial age is cast in a darker light. It was not the beginning of innovation, but the replacement of something far older, cleaner, and freer. Mainstream accounts remind us of the concrete milestones. In 1712, Thomas Newcomen developed the atmospheric steam engine, soon refined by James Watt in the 1760s. By the early 19th century, steam power drove factories, locomotives, and ships, fueling empires and global trade. Coal mining expanded massively, and with it came fortunes, pollution, and profound social upheaval. Scholars still debate whether industrialization was an inevitable step in human progress, or a contingent shift shaped by particular political and economic forces. Fringe researchers, however, frame it differently. They suggest that industrialization was not a natural breakthrough, but a takeover, an intentional redirection of society away from free energy systems and toward technologies that demanded fuel, labor, and centralized control. In this view, Tartaria's supposed wireless or atmospheric energy was erased, and in its place arose engines that could be taxed, patented, and monopolized. The smokestack became not just a symbol of progress, but of captivity. Quirky anecdotes provide strange contrast. Visitors to the Great Exhibition of 1851 in London marvelled at colossal steam engines, but also at intricate machines powered by forces less clear, hydraulic systems with mysterious efficiency, or displays of atmospheric engines that seem to run with minimal fuel. Some accounts describe demonstrations of electrical devices decades before electrification became mainstream, their principles left unexplained. Were these glimpses of suppressed technologies allowed briefly to surface before vanishing again? Scholars still debate whether such accounts are misunderstood, marvels of engineering, or fragments of a suppressed lineage. The industrial age also coincides eerily with the disappearance of Tartaria from maps. As coal, steam, and later oil redefined economies, the old word Tartary quietly vanished from atlases. Was this coincidence? Mainstream historians would say yes. As Russian and Chinese empires expanded, maps became more precise, and vague terms were discarded. But for alternative thinkers, the timing suggests orchestration, a reset of memory aligned with a reset of technology. Industrialization undeniably reshaped society. Populations surged into cities, drawn by wages and driven by necessity. Pollution choked rivers, child labour filled factories, and social unrest brewed. Yet it also concentrated power in the hands of industrialists and financiers, those who controlled fuel supplies and patents. If Tartaria's supposed energy was abundant and free, it would have threatened precisely these interests. Scholars still debate whether industrial capitalism arose organically from invention, or whether it was steered deliberately by those who sought control. The Industrial Revolution stands in textbooks as humanity's triumph. But if Tartaria's energy once existed, then the revolution may have been less about progress than about forgetting, burying a world of abundance under coal dust, replacing freedom with dependency, and ensuring that the engines of power would run not on air or sky, but on scarcity. Symbols in plain sight. Walk through any old city, Florence, Moscow, Mexico City, or Istanbul, and lift your gaze above the doorways and arches. Everywhere patterns emerge, spirals carved into stone, suns radiating from stained glass, stars etched into pavement, flowers blooming endlessly in ironwork. To most of us, these are decorative motifs, echoes of artistic styles passed down through centuries. Yet for those who believe Tartaria's legacy lingers, these designs are not mere ornament. They are symbols, coded reminders of a hidden science of energy. Mainstream historians trace these symbols to long traditions. The spiral, for example, appears in Neolithic carvings from Ireland's Newgrange tomb around 3200 BCE, often interpreted as a solar or seasonal motif. The star, particularly the five-pointed variety, emerges across Mesopotamian tablets, medieval heraldry, and Islamic art. Sunbursts and rosettes appear in Gothic cathedrals as metaphors for divine light. Each carries cultural weight, shaped by religion, philosophy, and aesthetics. Scholars still debate whether the persistence of such motifs reflects universal human psychology, or the diffusion of ideas across continents. Fringe interpretations press further. The spiral is reimagined as a symbol of energy flow, perhaps echoing the motion of electromagnetic fields. The sunburst becomes a literal representation of radiant power, not only divine, but technological. Star patterns etched into star forts, domes, and windows are viewed as schematics, geometric designs that might once have served functional purposes, channeling resonance or marking nodes in a forgotten energy grid. Quirky anecdotes abound. In some 18th and 19th century buildings, symbols appear not only in decorative friezes but stamped into iron machinery, lampposts, or railings. Why would a lamppost require intricate sunbursts if not to remind, or conce, an association with energy? Some researchers point to photographs of early electric lamps adorned with elaborate star patterns, suggesting the possibility of continuity between ornament and function. Scholars still debate whether such details are evidence of symbolism in utility, or simply the embellishments of an artistic age. Consider also the placement of these symbols. In Washington, D.C., the streets form geometric alignments visible from above, with stars and pentagons woven into the grid. In St. Petersburg, sun motifs crown bridges and gates, often gilded, as though announcing a relationship to light itself. Mainstream urban historians attribute these choices to Freemasonry, Renaissance ideals, or simple artistic flourish. Yet believers in Tartaria suggest a more pragmatic link. These symbols are not abstract but practical, reminders of energy systems now erased from memory. Mainstream scholars, cautious as always, insist that symbols alone cannot prove lost technologies. A spiral may represent eternity, not a vortex. A sun may mean divinity, not electricity. Yet they admit symbols often outlive their original meanings, drifting across time until they become decorative husks. Scholars still debate whether recurring motifs across civilizations reflect mere aesthetic preference or remnants of shared, forgotten knowledge. Symbols are slippery things. They can conceal as much as they reveal, serving both as decoration and as coded language. Whether Tartarian motifs were once functional or merely artistic, their persistence keeps alive the possibility of meaning. In plain sight, scattered across our cities, they whisper like a language we no longer speak, remnants of a script that once described not only beauty, but power, the children of the reset. Among the strangest footnotes of 19th century history are the orphan trains. Between the 1850s and the 1920s, more than 200,000 children were relocated across the United States, often sent from overcrowded cities in the East to new families in the rural Midwest. Photographs show rows of solemn young faces, dressed in ill-fitting clothes, awaiting placement with strangers. Mainstream accounts describe this as a well-meaning social experiment, an early attempt to address child poverty and homelessness. Yet, in the lore of Tartaria, the orphan trains take on a darker significance, evidence that a great reset had displaced entire populations, leaving children behind to be resettled in a world scrubbed clean of its past. The mainstream facts are clear enough. Charles Loring Brace, founder of the Children's Aid Society, spearheaded the orphan train movement in New York during the 1850s. He believed urban poverty bred crime and misery, and that relocating children to rural families would give them fresh starts. Trainloads of children were dispatched westward, where they were taken in by families eager for extra labour. Some thrived, others endured hardship or exploitation. Scholars still debate whether the programme was benevolent reform or a troubling experiment in social engineering. Fringe researchers focus on anomalies. Why, they ask, were there so many orphans at once? Why did entire trains depart regularly, filled with children described as lost or abandoned? Could these children have been survivors of some catastrophic event, perhaps the mud floods, fires, or resets said to have buried cities and erased populations? If Tartaria had indeed fallen, might these children have been its last remnants, quietly folded into a new society under a new story? Quirky anecdotes haunt the narrative. Some records describe children arriving with no memory of their origins, unable to state surnames or hometowns. Others note striking physical features, blonde-haired, blue-eyed children from regions where such traits were unusual. Mainstream historians attribute this to the chaos of immigration, poverty, and disease. Yet in the Tartarian lens, these children become ghosts of a vanished people, scattered deliberately to prevent collective memory from reforming. Scholars still debate whether such interpretations represent historical curiosity or imaginative overreach. The orphan phenomenon was not limited to America. In Britain, children were sent to colonies like Canada and Australia in similar schemes. In Russia, after wars and famines, vast numbers of orphans were relocated across the empire. To fringe thinkers, the pattern looks suspiciously global. Was this simply the grim reality of poverty in industrializing societies, or a coordinated effort to repopulate lands after a reset, distributing survivors into new frameworks of identity? Mainstream history pushes back firmly. There is no evidence of a hidden civilization, only the tragic outcomes of poverty, war, and social upheaval. Yet even scholars admit the orphan trains were unsettling. Large-scale displacements that reshaped communities, severed roots, and rewrote personal histories. The children of the reset, whether literal survivors of catastrophe or symbolic casualties of modernity, remain a haunting reminder of how easily memory can be erased. A child without a family, a past without a record, a civilization without a name, each leaves behind only questions. And in those questions the whispers of Tartaria linger, fragile as the faces staring out of sepia photographs. Echoes in folk memory. History may be written in ink, but memory often survives in song, tale, and ritual. Across the steppes of Asia, the forests of Siberia, and even the plains of Eastern Europe, fragments of folklore speak of lost cities, radiant towers, and lands where energy flowed freely. For mainstream historians, these are myths, expressions of human longing and imagination. But for those searching for Tartaria, these echoes are not mere stories, they are clues, faint recollections of a civilization erased from paper but lingering in the voice of the people. Mainstream scholarship gives folklore its due. The Buryats of Siberia tell of Belovodye, a hidden land of abundance. The Yakuts speak of great palaces swallowed by ice. In Russia, the legend of Kitezh describes a shining city that sank into a lake, its bells still tolling beneath the waters. Such tales are interpreted as allegories of loss, spirituality, or natural catastrophe. Scholars still debate whether these legends reflect purely symbolic truths or hazy memories of actual places now gone. Fringe researchers find resonance here. The sinking of Kitezh recalls the mud flood theories, where cities were buried suddenly, their spires left half visible. The radiant palaces of Belovodye resemble accounts of domed structures that harnessed free energy. Even lullabies and folk songs, with their references to stars, suns, and spirals, are reinterpreted as encoded fragments of Tartarian science. Could it be that oral traditions preserved truths forbidden from written record? Quirky anecdotes abound. In remote Siberian villages, elders have been recorded describing light without fire in the homes of ancestors. In Central Asia, travellers in the 19th century reported tales of towers that hummed, producing vibrations that carried for miles. Mainstream historians dismiss such stories as exaggerations or metaphors for spiritual illumination, yet they linger, stubborn and strange, as though refusing to vanish completely. Scholars still debate whether such tales are coincidences of metaphor or the survival of forgotten technologies reframed as legend. Folklore also crosses borders. In Native American traditions, stories describe great floods burying ancient settlements, followed by resettlement and rebuilding. In Scandinavia, sagas tell of radiant halls and fortresses whose lights could be seen across the sea. To believers in Tartaria, these parallels suggest a global memory of resets, events remembered in song even when erased from text. Mainstream voices remind us that humans everywhere tell stories of catastrophe and abundance. Flood myths appear from Mesopotamia to Mesoamerica. Radiant cities are archetypes of paradise. These similarities may reflect universal human psychology, not shared history. And yet, the persistence of certain motifs, buried cities, radiant towers, humming halls, invites us to wonder. Scholars still debate whether these echoes are mere coincidence, or whether myth might occasionally preserve fragments of forgotten fact. Folklore is slippery, never precise, always shifting with each retelling, but it is also resilient. When records are burned, songs survive. When maps are redrawn, tales linger in children's games and elders' stories. If Tartaria was erased deliberately, perhaps its memory was too vast, too embedded in the human imagination, to vanish entirely. And so, in lullabies sung to sleeping children, in stories told by firelight, the echoes remain, a soft defiance against the silence of official history. Skeptics at the gate. Every story has its guardians, and Tartaria's is no exception. For every whisper of buried cities and free energy, there stands a wall of skepticism. Historians, archaeologists, and engineers push back firmly against the claims, arguing that Tartaria is less a lost civilization than a collage of misunderstandings, an internet-age myth stitched together from architectural curiosities, misread maps, and the human hunger for mystery. Mainstream historians offer clear explanations. The term Tartary, they insist, was never meant to denote a single empire. It was a catch-all used by Europeans from the 16th to 19th centuries to describe the vast, poorly known regions of Central and Northern Asia. As Russian expansion consolidated these lands, the vague label fell away. Buildings thought too advanced for their era, like St. Petersburg's palaces or Chicago's exposition halls, are explained through available records of architects, funding, and labor. And those buried doors and windows? Raised streets, shifting foundations, or the quirks of urban growth? Scholars still debate whether the persistence of Tartaria theories is harmless curiosity or a worrying erosion of trust in expertise. Fringe researchers counter that skepticism often hides behind authority. They ask why certain anomalies are so quickly dismissed, why photographs of empty 19th century cities or encyclopedias with vanished entries are not examined with greater care. If Tartaria was only a cartographic placeholder, why do so many details, cities, divisions, rulers, appear in formal atlases? If expositions were purely theatrical, why demolish such magnificent architecture so swiftly? Quirky episodes illustrate the clash. In online forums, amateur sleuths pore over archives, comparing editions of the Encyclopaedia Britannica or analysing 19th century photographs. Academics, when asked, often respond with impatience, calling the theories baseless. The tension itself becomes part of the story. The sense of being brushed aside fuels suspicion. Scholars still debate whether engaging with such theories risks legitimizing them, or whether silence only makes the whispers grow louder. The skeptic's role is important. Without it, history would collapse into fantasy. Skepticism demands evidence, peer review, and consistency, and indeed, no verified artifact, inscription, or ruin has yet emerged that can be attributed definitively to Tartaria as imagined. The domes and spires belong to known architects. The star forts are well documented in military engineering. Mud floods, orphan trains, lost maps, all can be explained without invoking a vanished empire. Yet skepticism itself does not erase the allure. It may even sharpen it. The very act of denial, when combined with the silences of archives and the strangeness of anomalies, creates the impression of a cover-up. The debate becomes less about facts and more about trust, whether we believe the gatekeepers of history or those who peer through the cracks. Mainstream voices remind us that extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence. Fringe voices reply that extraordinary erasures leave little behind. Between them lies the fertile ground of curiosity, where skepticism and speculation duel endlessly. And in that duel, Tartaria persists, not as a proven civilization, but as a question that refuses to die, knocking quietly at the gates of accepted history. Energy of the sky, look upward on a stormy night, and you see the heavens alive with power. Lightning forks across the clouds, thunder shakes the earth, and the air itself crackles with charge. In the 18th and 19th centuries, scientists began to study this atmospheric electricity in earnest. Benjamin Franklin's famous kite experiment in 1752 proved that lightning was electrical in nature. Later, inventors built lightning rods, batteries, and Leyden jars to capture and experiment with this invisible force. Mainstream history celebrates these discoveries as stepping stones toward modern electricity. Yet within Tartarian lore, they are seen not as beginnings, but rediscoveries, fragments of a knowledge once widespread, then deliberately erased. The mainstream record is rich. In 1745, Peter van Musschenbroek of Leyden invented the Leyden jar, an early capacitor capable of storing electrical charge. By the early 1800s, Italian scientist Alessandro Volta had created the voltaic pile, the first true battery. James Clerk Maxwell, in the 1860s, laid out equations describing electromagnetic fields, which later underpinned radio, telegraphs, and electricity grids. Scholars still debate whether the early fascination with atmospheric electricity was a scientific curiosity or a serious attempt to harness a new source of power. Fringe thinkers seize on the atmospheric angle. If Franklin could draw charge from the sky with a kite and a key, why could not entire civilizations have done so with towers, domes, and spires? Tartarian architecture, with its gilded points and resonant domes, is reinterpreted as a vast network of collectors, channeling the energy of the sky into usable power. Where modern science sees danger in lightning's chaos, Tartarian law imagines a system that tamed it. Quirky anecdotes surface from old reports. In the early 19th century, newspapers occasionally described lamps in city squares that burned without fuel, glowing mysteriously. Some even suggested they drew power from the air itself, though no verifiable technology was recorded. In Russia, peasant tales spoke of fire from the sky that could be trapped in rods and used for light. Scholars still debate whether these were metaphors, misunderstandings of gaslight, or glimpses of experiments in atmospheric power. Mainstream science admits that the Earth's atmosphere is indeed charged. The global electrical circuit continuously moves current between the ground and the ionosphere. Lightning discharges billions of joules of energy each day, yet capturing and controlling this energy remains elusive. Modern experiments in wireless power transmission inspired by Tesla struggle with efficiency and scale. Still, the fact that the sky hums with power lends credibility to the imagination that others might have tried, perhaps successfully, in ages past. For Tartarian believers, this is the missing link. The domes, the spires, the gilded crosses, the very geometry of cities, all reimagined as parts of an atmospheric grid, quietly drawing charge from the heavens. The transition to coal and oil in this light was not progress, but a regression, an intentional abandonment of free power in favour of fuels that could be measured, sold, and monopolised. Mainstream historians shake their heads at such conclusions. Without hard evidence, atmospheric energy remains a dream, whether in Tesla's towers or Tartaria's domes. Yet the dream persists, precisely because the sky still reminds us of its power, flashing each storm with energy beyond comprehension. Scholars still debate whether humanity ever truly tapped that force, or whether we only imagine that we once did, longing for a forgotten harmony with the heavens when empires rewrite maps. History is not only written in books, it is drawn on maps. Every empire has known that to control geography is to control memory. Red lines and coloured blocks define not only borders, but identity itself. And when borders shift, so too does the story of who we believe existed. In the case of Tartaria, many who search for its traces argue that its disappearance was not natural but intentional, a redrawing of maps that erased more than territory. Mainstream history gives us countless examples of how maps evolve. In 1914, Austria-Hungary stretched across Central Europe. By 1919, it was gone. In the mid-20th century, the British Empire still painted much of the globe red. A few decades later, those colonies were sovereign states. Even the Soviet Union, vast and seemingly unbreakable, dissolved in 1991, leaving 15 new nations in its wake. Scholars still debate whether maps reflect reality or shape it, but all agree that maps are political tools as much as geographic records. In Tartaria's case, the shift is stark. From the 16th through the early 19th century, Great Tartary appears consistently on European maps, stretching across Siberia and Central Asia. Then, by mid-century, the word vanishes. The same lands are suddenly labelled as Russian Empire, Chinese Empire, Mongolia, or Siberia. To mainstream historians, this reflects improved cartography, vague names replaced by precise designations as exploration advanced. But for alternative thinkers, it resembles a deliberate overwrite. the act of removing a civilization by renaming its land. Scholars still debate whether this erasure was simply bureaucratic housekeeping or something more profound. Quirky cases emphasize the point. In some 18th century maps, Tartary is divided into independent Tartary, Chinese Tartary, and Little Tartary, as though political entities in their own right. Yet, no official records describe rulers or governments by those names. Did the mapmakers invent them, or were they recording something we no longer acknowledge? Some maps even place Tartaria alongside well-known states, suggesting parity. When the name disappears, so too do those details. The rewriting of maps is rarely neutral. After colonization, indigenous lands were renamed, erasing centuries of native identity. Rivers, mountains, and cities received European names, while local traditions were relegated to footnotes. In this context, the disappearance of Tartaria fits a familiar pattern. If empires could rename entire continents, why not redraw Asia's vastness into convenient parcels, removing a name that hinted at something larger than their control? Mainstream historians push back. They remind us that Tartary was never a cohesive state, but a label imposed by outsiders. Local peoples, Turkic, Mongolic, Slavic, and many others, had their own names and identities. The word Tartary was less erasure than simplification, abandoned when it outlived its usefulness. And yet, even this explanation concedes that maps can both reveal and conceal. Scholars still debate whether our trust in maps blinds us to the silences they impose. If maps are memory, then the erasure of Tartaria from them is more than semantics. It is a rewriting of who we believe we are. For those who search for its shadow, each missing label is not just a cartographic update, but a deliberate act of forgetting, ensuring that one vast word and the civilization it may have represented faded quietly into absence. The mystery of lost machines. History celebrates its machines. We revere the Antikythera mechanism from ancient Greece, marvel at the Baghdad battery, and reconstruct medieval astrolabes with pride. These artifacts prove that ingenuity has long flourished in human hands. Yet, alongside such well-documented marvels, whispers persist of stranger devices, machines glimpsed in old accounts, drawn in dusty manuscripts, or rumoured to have vanished altogether. In the lore of Tartaria, these lost machines are fragments of a suppressed technology, devices once capable of harnessing energy freely, erased before they could threaten the age of coal and oil. Mainstream historians remind us that lost machines are not unusual. Ancient inventions often disappear when empires collapse or when knowledge is no longer needed. Hero of Alexandria's steam engine, built in the 1st century CE, was forgotten for centuries. Chinese mechanical clocks of the Tang dynasty vanished after political turmoil. Even in modern times, prototypes and patents are abandoned when economies shift. Scholars still debate whether these gaps are failures of preservation or signs of something more deliberate. Fringe researchers focus on anomalies from the 18th and 19th centuries. In some illustrated catalogues, devices appear that seem curiously advanced. Lamps said to glow without oil, fountains that operated without visible pumps, or ornate engines described as perpetual motion machines. Officially, these were either artistic fantasies or misunderstood designs. Yet the drawings linger, fueling suspicion. Were these glimpses of Tartarian machines, technologies too disruptive to survive into the industrial era? Quirky anecdotes add intrigue. In the 1870s, reports from Russia described a singing column, a metallic structure that produced tones when touched, baffling engineers. In Central Asia, travellers claimed to see abandoned towers with gears and mechanisms, their purpose unknown. In the American West, prospectors sometimes uncovered strange metallic fragments in old ruins, dismissed as scrap but curiously resistant to corrosion. Scholars still debate whether these are legends, exaggerations, or misidentified artifacts. Consider also the fate of inventions that challenged industrial monopolies. Nikola Tesla's wireless energy devices, John Worrell Keely's vibratory motor in the 1870s, and Victor Schauberger's vortex machines in the 20th century all promised revolutionary uses of natural forces, yet each was either suppressed, discredited, or dismantled. Mainstream historians attribute this to scientific flaws or lack of funding, but for Tartarian theorists, these inventors were not anomalies, they were heirs to an older knowledge, echoing machines that once powered a forgotten world. Mainstream accounts caution against reading too much into rumour. Most lost machines remain the stuff of legend, their functions unverifiable. And yet, history admits that technologies can vanish, sometimes by chance, sometimes by choice. Scholars still debate whether suppression plays a larger role than we care to admit. The mystery of lost machines is less about any single device than about the pattern, the recurring sense that knowledge has been glimpsed, then erased. If Tartaria truly existed, then its machines would be the most dangerous evidence of all, proof not only that another path was possible, but that it was taken from us. Cataclysms as cover stories. Throughout recorded history, disasters have rewritten the world. Fires have consumed cities, floods have swept away villages, and earthquakes have toppled monuments that once seemed eternal. To mainstream historians, these cataclysms are simply the unpredictable rhythms of nature, tragic, destructive, but ultimately explainable. Yet in the lore of Tartaria, such events take on a darker role. They are not merely natural disasters, but cover stories, convenient explanations for why entire architectures, technologies, and civilizations disappeared in plain sight. The mainstream record is filled with examples. The Great Fire of London in 1666 destroyed more than 13,000 houses and nearly 100 churches. The Lisbon earthquake of 1755 levelled much of the city, sparking philosophical debates about fate and providence. The Chicago fire of 1871 reduced wooden neighbourhoods to ash, paving the way for steel-frame skyscrapers. These events are well documented, their causes studied by geologists and historians alike. Scholars still debate the precise scale of certain disasters, but not their reality. Fringe researchers, however, note suspicious patterns. Many of the cities struck by devastating fires in the 19th century, Chicago, Boston, San Francisco, had recently hosted or constructed ornate buildings resembling the exposition palaces we have already examined. In some cases, the fires seemed almost selective, sparing wooden shacks while consuming stone or fireproof structures. Could it be, they ask, that these catastrophes were not accidents but orchestrated resets, erasing Tartarian architecture under the guise of natural disaster? Quirky anecdotes pepper the reports. Eyewitnesses to the Chicago fire described flames that leapt unnaturally, fueled by winds so fierce they seemed conjured. In San Francisco, some claimed dynamite was used to control the fire, demolishing entire districts in the process. After Lisbon's earthquake, rumours spread of underground blasts, as though the catastrophe was not purely geological. Scholars still debate whether such details represent exaggerations born of trauma or faint hints that disasters may sometimes cloak human intervention. Even floods play their part. Accounts of mud floods describe cities suddenly submerged in layers of silt with lower floors buried overnight. Mainstream geology attributes this to landslides, river overflows, or gradual sediment accumulation. Yet believers in Tartaria argue that floods offered a perfect cover for deliberate erasure, burying old structures while allowing new powers to claim the rebuilt city as their own. Mainstream historians acknowledge that disasters often provide opportunities for political change. After London's fire, rebuilding reshaped the city into a modern capital. After San Francisco's earthquake, corporate interests consolidated power. After Lisbon's devastation, Enlightenment philosophies spread rapidly. Scholars still debate whether catastrophe itself is the driver of such change, or whether human hands seize chaos to steer history's course. In the Tartarian framework, this seizing becomes sinister. Fires, floods, and quakes are remembered not only as tragedies, but as tools. They become the perfect cover stories for erasure, allowing a civilization to be scrubbed from sight while the world mourns the accident. Disasters remind us of nature's force, but they also remind us of vulnerability, how quickly memory can be buried in ash, drowned in mud, or shaken into rubble. If Tartaria was truly undone, perhaps it was not by nature alone, perhaps nature's fury was the mask, and behind it moved the hands of those who preferred forgetting to remembering. The curious case of calendars. Time is the skeleton of history. We measure our past in days, years, and centuries, as though calendars themselves are unshakable anchors. Yet the very way we track time has shifted dramatically through the ages, leaving room for gaps, overlaps, and distortions. In the lore of Tartaria, calendars are not neutral tools, but instruments of control, adjusted to obscure events, to shorten or lengthen eras, and perhaps to conceal the true timeline of a forgotten civilization. Mainstream history provides striking examples. The Julian calendar, introduced by Julius Caesar in 45 BCE, reigned across Europe for over 1,600 years. But its slight inaccuracy, drifting one day every 128 years, prompted Pope Gregory XIII to introduce the Gregorian calendar in 1582. To correct the drift, 10 days were dropped from that October, vanishing overnight from the record. Catholic nations adopted it quickly, while Protestant countries resisted for centuries. Britain and its colonies only switched in 1752, skipping 11 days. Scholars still debate whether such changes sowed confusion in the historical record, though they agree the intent was astronomical precision, not conspiracy. Fringe thinkers, however, note how these shifts create fertile ground for mischief. If entire days can vanish from official time, what prevents entire centuries from being compressed, extended, or invented? Some theorists propose that the so-called phantom time hypothesis, which suggests portions of the early Middle Ages were fabricated, might intersect with Tartaria's disappearance. Could calendar reforms have helped reframe history, erasing the memory of a civilization by simply shifting the clock? Quirky anecdotes arise in cultural memory. In Russia, the switch to the Gregorian calendar did not occur until after the Bolshevik Revolution of 1917, creating a period when citizens mark Old Style and New Style dates simultaneously. Letters, newspapers, and contracts had to note both, sometimes leading to confusion. Believers in Tartarian law point to this as proof that time itself can be manipulated by decree. Scholars still debate whether this was simply bureaucratic messiness, or a reminder of how fragile our chronology truly is. Calendars also conceal cultural resets. The French Revolution introduced a new republican calendar in 1793, erasing saints' days and traditional weeks in favour of 10-day decades. Though abandoned in 1806, it reveals how political forces can attempt to overwrite collective memory through timekeeping itself. Similarly, Soviet authorities experimented with work calendars that broke the 7-day week. If modern regimes manipulate calendars for ideological reasons, why not earlier empires seeking to bury Tartaria? Mainstream historians push back firmly. They argue that while calendars have shifted, cross-referenced astronomical events, eclipses, comets, solstices, anchor our chronology securely. These celestial markers cannot be forged so easily, and yet even they admit that our dating systems are human constructions, prone to error, politics, and revision. Scholars still debate whether calendar reforms merely clarify history or subtly distort it. For Tartarian seekers, the calendar becomes more than a clock. It is a veil, one adjusted not only to mark the passing of time, but to obscure what lies beneath it. If days and even years can be erased with the stroke of a decree, then perhaps centuries of memory, whole civilizations, can also be shifted just out of reach, leaving us to live in a timeline carefully rewritten. Resonance and the human body. Step into a cathedral and feel the deep tones of an organ roll through the air. The vibrations do not stop at the ear, they ripple through the chest, the skin, even the bones. Sound is not only heard, it is felt. For those who believe in Tartaria's lost knowledge, this is not incidental, but central. Resonance was not merely an architectural curiosity, but a technology designed to interact directly with the human body, harmonizing us with the forces of nature. Mainstream science recognizes the power of resonance. Physicians use ultrasound to peer inside the body, and certain frequencies can shatter kidney stones or even levitate small particles in laboratory conditions. Musical therapy demonstrates how sound affects mood, heart rate, and brain waves. Ancient cultures seem to know this intuitively. Chanting in Buddhist temples, Gregorian hymns in cathedrals, and drumming rituals among indigenous peoples all produce profound physiological effects. Scholars still debate whether these practices evolved purely for spiritual expression, or whether they preserved fragments of a deeper science. Fringe interpretations suggest Tartarian architecture amplified this connection. Domes, arches, and spires might not only have gathered energy from the atmosphere, but also shaped it into frequencies that influenced the human body. In this view, entering a cathedral or star fort was not only about prayer or defense, but about tuning oneself like an instrument to the resonance of the building. Quirky anecdotes bring colour. Travellers in the 19th century wrote of entering certain Russian churches and experiencing dizziness, warmth, or sudden calm, even in silence. Folk traditions claimed that walking labyrinths in cathedral floors could heal ailments or sharpen the mind. In some star forts, visitors noticed echoes that seemed to come from unexpected directions, disorienting the senses. Mainstream historians attribute these to psychology, acoustics, or suggestion. Yet to Tartarian seekers, they suggest a forgotten interaction between body and architecture. Scholars still debate whether such sensations are coincidence, placebo, or echoes of lost design principles. Consider also the role of frequency in Tesla's work. Tesla once described resonance as the key to unlocking energy, famously noting, "If you want to find the secrets of the universe, think in terms of energy, frequency, and vibration." Tartarian lore casts this as more than metaphor. They argue that buildings, machines, and even rituals once tuned into these frequencies to empower both individuals and communities. Resonance, in this sense, was both physical and spiritual, a bridge between human biology and natural forces. Mainstream voices remind us that evidence is lacking. No cathedral blueprint mentions tuning to human chakras. No star fort manual describes healing harmonics. Yet they acknowledge that resonance has always fascinated humanity, from Pythagoras' music of the spheres to modern bioacoustics. Scholars still debate whether ancient builders merely stumbled upon these effects, or whether they pursued them intentionally. The idea that Tartaria harnessed resonance for both power and well-being stretches the imagination. Yet it also resonates with something deeply human, the sense that we are not separate from the world, but vibrate with it, bound by frequencies that sing through stone, sky, and skin alike. Modern cities on ancient bones. Walk through the boulevards of Paris, the canals of St. Petersburg, or the avenues of Mexico City, and beneath your feet lie layers of forgotten worlds. Modern cities rarely stand on empty ground. They grow atop their predecessors, reusing foundations, recycling stones, and burying what came before. Mainstream archaeology acknowledges this layering as the palimpsest of history, the natural rhythm of human settlement. But in the lore of Tartaria, these foundations are not merely ancient, they are the bones of a lost civilization whose remains were quietly absorbed into the cities we inhabit today. Mainstream examples abound. Rome is famously a city of layers, where medieval churches rise over Roman temples, and Roman temples themselves stand on Etruscan sites. Mexico City rests atop Tenochtitlan, the Aztec capital, whose ruins still emerge in its heart. Even London conceals Roman walls beneath modern office towers. Scholars still debate how best to preserve these strata, balancing modern life with the fragile memory beneath. For Tartarian seekers, however, the layering hides something more deliberate. They argue that many 18th and 19th century cities did not begin from scratch, but were built on top of, and perhaps even repurposed from, structures far older. The grand boulevards of St. Petersburg, said to have been raised in only a few decades, are reinterpreted as inherited architecture claimed by the Romanovs but built by forgotten hands. Similarly, the ornate facades of American frontier towns, which seemed to spring up overnight in the 19th century, are cast as relics of Tartaria, quietly assimilated into the story of new nations. Quirky anecdotes add fuel. In some construction projects, workers uncover vast stone foundations with no known builders. In Seattle, the famous underground city reveals entire street levels buried beneath. Beneath newer ones, their storefronts intact but forgotten. In Paris, the catacombs snake beneath the streets, repurposed quarries that once supplied the very stones of the city above. While mainstream explanations are straightforward, urban evolution, geology, necessity, fringe thinkers ask whether these subterranean layers are traces of a world erased. Scholars still debate whether such discoveries are routine archaeology or hints at suppressed history. Even infrastructure echoes the question. Modern cities often align along rivers, ley lines, or grids that mirror older designs. In Washington, D.C., the street plan contains Masonic symbolism. In Barcelona, Ildefonso Cerda's 19th century grid overlays what some believe were older sacred geometries. Was this coincidence or continuity with a knowledge we no longer acknowledge? Mainstream historians warn against conflating reuse with mystery. Civilizations have always built atop one another, reshaping the landscape to suit their needs. Yet they admit that many questions remain. Who built the earliest layers we now take for granted? How much of ancient urban design has been lost in the rubble of progress? Scholars still debate whether we underestimate the depth of history beneath our cities. For those who believe in Tartaria, every subway tunnel and buried foundation is a reminder. Our modern capitals, they argue, are not simply products of modern genius, but inheritances constructed upon bones we pretend not to see. If true, then the very streets we walk daily are not only paths of the present, but corridors through a forgotten empire that still lies beneath our feet. Why erase free energy? Every mystery eventually turns toward motive. If Tartaria truly possessed a system of free energy, whether drawn from the sky, resonated through architecture, or transmitted wirelessly, why would such a marvel vanish? Why would anyone or any power choose to erase it from the record? The question lies at the heart of the Tartarian enigma, for it touches not only on technology, but on human ambition, greed, and control. Mainstream historians caution against the premise itself. They argue there is no verified evidence that such a system ever existed, and therefore no erasure to explain. Progress, they insist, moved from fire to steam, from coal to electricity, following a clear arc of invention. To introduce a missing chapter of free energy is to conjure a problem that never was. Scholars still debate whether skepticism alone is sufficient, or whether anomalies in architecture and maps deserve deeper examination. Fringe researchers see motive everywhere. Energy is not just power, it is profit. A system of free energy would dissolve empires of industry, unravel monopolies, and dismantle entire hierarchies built on scarcity. If Tartaria's technologies allowed cities to glow without coal, to heat without wood, to build without fuel, then the arrival of coal barons, oil magnates, and financiers would have been impossible. What better reason to bury it? The Industrial Revolution, in this view, was not the triumph of invention, but the triumph of control, replacing abundance with dependence. Quirky anecdotes echo this logic. J.P. Morgan, who once financed Tesla's experiments, allegedly withdrew support when he realized Tesla's wireless energy system could not be metered. "Where do we put the meter?" is the phrase often attributed to him, a symbol of profit-thwarting possibility. Whether or not Morgan ever spoke those words, the sentiment captures the pay. Radox, free energy threatens those who profit from scarcity. Scholars still debate whether such anecdotes reflect historical truth or convenient legend. Consider also the political dimension. Energy is not only economic, but strategic. Empires have always been built on fuel. Roman armies marched on grain, the British Navy on coal, America's global reach on oil. If free energy once existed, it would have destabilized the entire geopolitical order. How could empires tax it? How could they control it? If power flowed freely from sky or earth, power itself, the power over people, would be impossible to consolidate. Mainstream voices counter with pragmatism. Even if such energy existed, they argue, societies of the past lacked the infrastructure to use it effectively. Technology is not just invention, but systems, wires, grids, factories, economies. Without these, free energy would have been little more than a curiosity. And yet, they admit, suppression of disruptive inventions has occurred before, whether through patents locked away, projects abandoned, or discoveries lost in war. Scholars still debate where suppression ends and coincidence begins. The motive, then, is both obvious and unsettling. To erase free energy is to preserve control. To bury it is to ensure dependence. Whether Tartaria ever harnessed such a gift may remain unproven, but the logic of erasure feels uncomfortably familiar. It asks us to imagine a history where abundance was possible, and to confront the forces that might prefer we never know, the long shadow of forgetting. As we near the end of this journey, the question lingers like a candle in a darkened hall. What does it mean for a civilization to be forgotten? Whether Tartaria was a vast empire of free energy or merely a cartographic phantom, its story, half erased, half imagined, casts a long shadow across our understanding of history. For in the gaps of memory, we find not only mystery, but possibility. Mainstream historians remind us that forgetting is common. Languages vanish, cultures fade, empires collapse into dust. The Maya cities of Central America were swallowed by jungle until rediscovered in the 19th century. The Indus Valley civilization lay unknown for millennia, its script unreadable to this day. Even within recorded history, centuries can be darkened by missing texts or destroyed libraries. Scholars still debate whether Tartaria belongs in this company of genuine mysteries, or whether it is simply the echo of a word misunderstood. Fringe seekers argue that forgetting can also be deliberate. They point to the suppression of inconvenient knowledge, Tesla's confiscated papers, maps with vanished labels, architecture demolished under the guise of fires and floods. They suggest that Tartaria was not lost by accident but erased by design, its memory buried beneath layers of industry, empire, and silence. Quirky fragments keep the shadow alive. A star fort glimpsed from a plane, still crisp in its geometry, a cathedral dome humming softly when the choir sings, a child's lullaby about a shining city beneath the lake. These are not proofs, but they are reminders that the past is never fully gone, only waiting to be interpreted. Scholars still debate whether these fragments are mere curiosities or the sparks of something greater. The long shadow of forgetting stretches beyond Tartaria itself. It forces us to ask how much of what we accept as hist is shaped by what we are allowed to know. How many chapters lie missing, edited away by fire, flood, or decree? And how might our present and our future change if even one of those missing pages were restored? Whether Tartaria was real or imagined, free energy, fact, or fiction, the story serves as a mirror. It reflects our hopes for abundance, our fears of control, and our unease with silence. To believe in Tartaria is to believe that history may still hold secrets, and that erasure itself can be as powerful as invention. And so, the shadow remains. Not proof, not certainty, but possibility. The faint outline of a civilization that may have existed, erased yet not entirely gone, still whispering from beneath the layers of time. Conclusion. The journey through Tartaria's supposed free energy brings us to a paradox. On one hand, mainstream history insists on skepticism, no solid evidence, no verifiable artifacts, no unbroken lineage of knowledge. On the other, the anomalies, sunken windows, vanished encyclopedias, strange maps, and uncanny architecture linger stubbornly, refusing to be dismissed. Scholars still debate whether these are accidents of history or fragments of something suppressed. Perhaps Tartaria is less a lost empire than a story about forgetting itself. It reminds us that history is fragile, always vulnerable to erasure by disaster, conquest, or choice. And it invites us to remain curious, to question, and to listen carefully to the echoes that survive in stone, in song, and in silence. For whether Tartaria was fact, fiction, or something in between, it carries one enduring lesson. The past is never as fixed as we imagine. It shifts like shadows at dusk, reminding us that memory can be lost, and that sometimes what is erased may still shape us in ways unseen.